Hello and welcome to our first speaker event of the spring 2023 for the Lytton Center for History and the Public Good here at Ohlone College. My name is Dr. Kyle Livy. I am professor of history here at Ohlone College and co-director of the Lytton Center. And I'm joined here by my fellow co-director, Dr. Heather McCarthy, who is also a professor here in the history department, who will be introducing our speaker today. I'm going to do a few sort of housekeeping items before we get started. And as people are getting settled in, we're very excited to present our guest, Dr. Donna Murch, professor at Rutgers University, to give her talk in just a few moments. We are very excited to also have you share in this talk and participate by joining in the conversation during a Q&A that will follow the talk. To do this, please use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen here on the Zoom webinar. We love hearing your questions and comments about the talk, about Dr. Murch's research, and of course, about everything and anything to do with doing research and this career path. And we're very excited to explore this together. I want to share before going any further and passing things over on to my illustrious colleague, Dr. McCarty. I want to share the mission of the Lytton Center, as we like to do. The Lytton Center considers ways that the study of the past can help shape the present and the future. Our mission is to inspire the Ohlone community to work for the public good through programming focused on access, equity, inclusion, justice, and service. The Lytton Center explores challenges facing our community and the world, past, present, and future, and fosters big ideas that will inspire and transform Ohlone and the larger community for the better. Through training, programming, and capacity building, the Lytton Center empowers students to advocate for a just and equitable world. So it's my pleasure to pass things over to you, Dr. McCarty, who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that. It is my privilege and pleasure to introduce Professor Donna Murch. She is an activist, an award-winning author, and an associate professor of history at Rutgers University. At Rutgers, Dr. Murch is also president of the New Brunswick chapter of the Rutgers AAUP-AFT, which is a union affiliated with the AFL-CIO and represents faculty, graduate workers, postdocs, and counselors. Professor Murch has published several books and written for numerous popular press and academic publications, including the Sunday Washington Post, The Guardian, The New Republic, The Nation, The Black Scholar, The Journal of Urban History, The Journal of American History, and many, many others. In October of 2010, Professor Murch published Living for the City, Migration, Education, and the Rise of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California, which won the Phyllis Wheatley Prize. And Professor Murch's newest book, Assata Taught Me, State Violence, Racial Capitalism, and the Movement for Black Lives, was published by Haymarket Books in March of 2022. She has also appeared on the BBC, the CNN, Democracy Now!, and in a couple of documentaries as well. Professor Murch is currently completing a new trade press book entitled Capitalism Plus Dope: Policing the Crisis and the War on Drugs in Los Angeles, which we are all going to have the pleasure to learn a little bit more about in today's talk. So please join me in welcoming Professor Murch to give her talk today. And before I hand things over, I just want to remind everyone that we have a Q&A feature to use. So as you're listening to this talk, if you have thoughts or questions that you want to share, you can go ahead and put those right into that Q&A link down at the bottom. Thank you so much, and I'll hand things over to you.
Hello, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here. I'm going to start my slides, and please let me know if there are any technical difficulties and you aren't able to see the slides. Okay, so welcome. I'm so glad to be here. I got my PhD with Dr. McCarty back in the late 90s and early 2000s. And in many ways, community colleges were so crucial for my story that I told about the Black Panther Party, and also for myself, because I worked as an adjunct at Berkeley City College my final year of graduate school. So today I'm going to talk about my new book that I'm working on, Capitalism Plus Dope, the Crack Crisis and War on Drugs in Los Angeles. But in addition to talking about the content, I'm also going to take you on a little bit of a journey about how I ended up there, because I think one of the things that's most rewarding as a historian is thinking about who you are and placing yourself in the present, and then thinking about the research and the stories you choose to tell about the past. So as historians, we also know that the subjectivity of the historian, it really matters. So I'm going to share a little bit with you of my own trajectory, both in the research and then how it linked to the things that I care about. So right now I have a slide up for Living for the City. This is my first book. It was based on my dissertation, and it was really a story about the Black Panther Party who—
I'm going to interrupt you for a second because your slides are not showing up.
Oh, they're not showing up?
No.
Oh, thank you for telling me. That's probably because I did not share them properly. Okay, let's see. Can everyone see them now?
Perfect. Yes, we can see them now. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. So this book was based on my dissertation that I wrote in Berkeley, where I graduated in 2004 when I got my job at Rutgers and moved back to the East Coast. But at that time, the Black Panther Party in many ways was an organization that was outside of the elite domains of popular memory. So there was a lot of anger at the party from different institutions. It was especially true at Berkeley because the Black Panther Party was founded just 15 minutes from the Berkeley campus. And it was also essential to this period of real rebellion and upheaval in the 1960s. So it's part of the story of Berkeley in the 60s. But in the years since then, there had been a real striking at the past and the role of university and radical protest. So in the 1990s, you had the throwing out of affirmative action with the Regents decision. And then after that, the California Civil Rights Initiative, which took race out of all state programs and all forms of affirmative action. And it was actually drafted by a law professor at Bolt Hall. So the Panthers were a very controversial group, but I was interested in telling a history, a community-based history, independently of the things that they were most known for, which was armed struggle. And one of the things that I found is that the true genesis of the Black Panther Party started in a community college, much like Ohlone College. It's called Merritt, originally Oakland City College, and then in the mid-60s, the name is turned into Merritt College. But it's a story about people migrating from the South and arriving in American cities at the height of the long Black freedom struggle. That includes both the fight for civil rights in the South and the fight against housing discrimination, job discrimination, and state violence in the North. But it's nurtured a group of young people who are probably the age that you are. Many of them were in their mid to late teens and early 20s. And they formed a study group. And out of that study group is where you end up with this organization, the Black Panther Party, having been founded. So I want to start with this time period, both because it's a trajectory I took through the different books that I've written, but also to think about the historical trajectory. So in the 1960s and early 1970s, in many ways, this is a time of real radicalization among Black people in all different locations and spaces. You have the fight against legal segregation in the South, and then in the North, you have a fight that's largely economic: housing, education, and jobs. So it's dealing with the long-term legacies of white supremacy, white nationalism, and racial segregation, which did take place in the North. We often focus on the South, but it took place in the North. So I just wanted to show you some pictures of that period, because I think they really imbue the era with that sense of hope, possibility, and transformation. So this image is taken in 1955 in West Oakland, and it's taken at a community center that's right in the heart of the community. Many of the people had migrated from the South, and this was essentially an etiquette program that was sponsored by the city of Oakland. And it was a way of kind of managing the new migrant population that was migrating from the South. So this is a picture of these young people in 1955. And this is a picture of young people, let's see, in 1968. So that is 13 years later. Here we have a fraternal organization for young men. And then 13 years later, you have these images from 1968. And I wanted to show you that just to take us back to that period of the late 60s where young people are defining for themselves who they are and how they're going to mobilize in the Black freedom struggle. So the 60s, although filled with pain and loss, we have the assassination of Martin Luther King, we have the jailing of tens of thousands of people after the urban rebellions. So I don't want to be nostalgic about the 60s, but it's nevertheless a time of real hope and possibility. And I wanted to place myself within this history. So this is a picture of me roughly in 1979, 1980. And I too went to a community center. And it was at the tail end of the war on poverty. You had, as a form of economic support for Black communities in the North and South, you had money coming from the federal government to support job training and community action programs. And so I actually was part of one of those community center programs in the 70s and early 80s. And I think that that participation also allowed me, when I was studying Oakland, to think about those important forms of community and community mobilization, and also very importantly, the role of the arts, which were actually absolutely central to the Black Panther Party. So this is an image from the Black Panther newspaper. One of the things about the Panther Party was that it was also a real intellectual and art movement. I would call it as part of the history of Black power and Black aesthetics. But at its core, it was trying to fight state violence. So I think that this is familiar to you because of the struggle that we've seen over the past 13 or 14 years with Black Lives Matter and people protesting police killings of Black people. But in the Black Panther Party's case, they were interested in linking the wars that the United States conducts. They thought of them as colonial wars fought in the non-white parts of the world in the global South. And they wanted to make the connection between local police, the National Guard, and the Marines. So how are they connected? You see the billy club that says napalm. That is a form of, it's a chemical agent that was used to defoliate trees during warfare. And it's a pesticide, so it's also extremely toxic to fauna, flora, to people and animals. And so they're making an argument that all these three different forms of military and police are part of the same issue. So they were constantly linking their struggle at home to the struggles of other non-white people abroad. And also the Panthers organized across racial lines. So they were an active coalition with white radicals that they called Mother Country radicals. Now, as I was researching this, the Panther Party, and I ended up writing a history of their formation in Oakland and the central role of community colleges within that. But I also was looking at the archive of the party, and I came across this pamphlet called Capitalism Plus Dope Equals Genocide. And it was written by a young Panther. He was still in his teens, 18 or 19, but he had actually started using heroin at age 12 or 13. And there was a huge heroin crisis in post-war Black communities, not unlike the opioid crisis that we're seeing today across different racial groups. But in this case, it's also in the context of the Vietnam War. which was a part of how so much heroin was being imported into the United States. So unfortunately, each major war in the United States has also been accompanied with domestic drug crises. And that has to do with imperial violence abroad, especially anti-communist violence, being linked to repressive campaigns at home. And I can talk about that some more. But he was able to go into recovery, and he was helped by some young Panthers. And their argument about drug addiction and drug use is that its true solution was not pharmaceuticals. It was not religion. It was to transform the world in which young people live in. And this pamphlet was incredibly popular. The party actually sold it to make money, like they did their newspaper. That's how they funded themselves. They weren't a not-for-profit, getting money from the Ford Foundation or from the federal government. They were self-funded. But seeing this pamphlet, seeing its importance, it made me think about the Panthers' understanding about drug crises. I did a series of oral histories with Panthers, and many of them talked about the end of their movement, not through police and counterintelligence, but the actual takeoff of drug crises and drug epidemics. So they saw this as a disorganizing force inside the community, and that it was central in their minds to the slowing and stopping ultimately of their own organization and their own movement. So this just opened a whole set of questions for me. How do I understand what this is? One thing that's very important about this is that the Panthers are founded in Oakland, California. And in the subsequent years, in the 1990s, you had a famous journalist, Gary Webb, who was researching the origins of the crack crisis. But he was writing for the San Jose Mercury News, which is very close to Oakland. So while I was living in Oakland and researching the Panther Party, this history of the 90s was unfolding around me. And it wasn't until much later that I began to fully understand the different forms of connection. I guess since this is a webinar, I was going to ask people's different interpretations of this image, but we can talk about that in the question and answer afterwards. But I wanted to show you this image, which is from Banksy. And it's his commentary about the origins of the crack crisis. So when we get to Q&A, think about this image and the argument that he's trying to make. Like, what is the argument here? What is the phrase that he chose? What does that mean? What do we make of this image? So I will leave that to the question and answer period. But I think that this is one of my favorite images about the crack crisis. And it's speaking to a different way to understand drug crises. It speaks to issues of economics. And it also speaks to questions of class and power. So often when we talk about drug crises, we think of broken people and broken dreams at an individual level. But this is a social and political argument about a drug crisis. So today I'm going to tell you a tale of two crises. And I'm going to talk about largely about the crack crisis and the war on drugs, but we're also going to end by thinking about its relationship to the opioid crisis. So I recently published a new book called Asada Taught Me, and it's really a collection of essays from the last 10 years. And one of my favorite essays in there is called How Race Made the Opioid Crisis. And it's a call to think about these two frames, these two images and these two phenomena, to think about them in the same frame, because their origins and their development take place at the same time. And I think there's a lot to be learned, both about race and questions of power, and how we can use these two drug crises to talk about that. So here we have an image that is from Los Angeles in 1985. So that is from my research site. And what this is a battering ram. And it was used by Daryl Gates in 1985. You see the LAPD logo on the side. And the idea was that in order to prevent people from destroying evidence, they adapted a military vehicle, put this giant ram on the front, which is actually inside the house. You can't quite see the end of it. And to tear down the walls of people's houses. This was used several times in 1985. There were, the first time it was used was out in the valley, and no drugs were found, but it was a young woman with her 2 children sitting at the kitchen table eating ice cream. But I wanted to show you this image of the use of a military vehicle to see the enormous violence and the use essentially of weapons of war in the drug war in Los Angeles. So an important thing to know is that the United States has had multiple punishment campaigns, so drug prohibition campaigns. It doesn't start in the 1980s. You have the first modern drug war really taking off in 1970 under the declaration of Richard Nixon. But going back further than that, you have anti-prohibition efforts that were often targeted at people of color. So in the late 19th century, you have Chinese exclusion. And one of the big justifications for stopping Chinese immigration was the idea that they were transporting opium, which was not true. The real origins of the opium crisis in China was directly linked to an imperial war led by England that literally forced China to open its markets to opium in order to improve Britain's balance of trade. Same thing happens in the 1930s. You know, we call marijuana, but we use that name rather than cannabis because it was a racialized name that linked the herb itself with the migration of people from Mexico. So drug prohibition linked to race is not new, but I would argue this period in the 1980s and 1990s is so formative for the creation of mass incarceration. One of the major points that I'll be making in this talk is that we often think of Republicans as having been responsible, like Ronald Reagan, but as we will see, Democrats and Republicans both supported these punishment campaigns. And it's actually under Bill Clinton that we see the single largest number of people being charged with drug offenses. The great writer and abolitionist Michelle Alexander stressed that in 1982, when Ronald Reagan declares the second war on drugs, that only 2% of people in survey data mentioned drugs as important. And her argument is that what this was really about was questions of race and the use of hysteria around crack to justify the war on drugs. So what is this second war on drugs? So here I have an image for you of crack cocaine. And what crack cocaine is it is coca that's taken from the plant. It is processed, and then a kind of dark, milky substance is extracted. And the important thing about it is that it's highly adulterated. So crack is much less concentrated than powder cocaine, and it is mixed with baking soda, which was a very little technology was needed to do this. So crack is much cheaper than the other drugs available in the market, and it was also very easy to make. So the first point is that Ronald Reagan announces the war on drugs in 1982, but the first reporting that you have on crack cocaine is not until 1985. So Michelle Alexander uses this point to say that the war on drugs actually precedes crack. And I'll be talking today about how both the war on drugs and the crack crisis had really detrimental effects for Black communities. But it's very important to uncouple the two. Crack became a justification for the war on drugs, but it actually happened first. So as you know, as historians, chronology is extremely important. That's how we figure out cause and also interpret events. So it was the war on drugs that justified a big expansion in federal law enforcement. So this is important to know because this is a period where after the 1960s and 1970s, Ronald Reagan and the Republican Party wanted to roll back the winds of the 1960s. That a big part of the Reagan presidency was criticizing the 60s, attacking the Black movement, and arguing that social welfare and the extension of the New Deal welfare state to Black and Brown people was destructive. So he had a very strong racial message. And in a time when you had a tax revolt where the silent majority, large numbers of white people resisted paying taxes. The classic example is Proposition 13. That in a time of fiscal austerity, the drug war became a way to expand state power. It's hard to underestimate the amount of monies spent by the federal government on drugs, on drug prohibition. Between 1980 and 1984, the Federal Bureau of Anti-Drugs spent from 8 million. It went from 8 million in 1980 to the moment when Reagan assumed office to 95 million. The Department of Defense, their anti-drug allocation increased from 33 million in 1981 to over 1.42 billion for those years up to 1991. The DEA also, the total monies received exceeded over 800 million. So what we're seeing is, first of all, the drug war has many, many arms. There are literally 24 agencies that are involved in the prosecution of the drug war. So you have both the FBI, the CIA, the National Security Administration. You have all different parts of government involved in this. And this was a very, very expensive proposition. So it's interesting, in a time of fiscal austerity, people don't want to spend money to help feed children or to house the houseless, but we have all these monies being channeled into the war on drugs. I think in order to understand the war on drugs, crucial to this is the role of the media. And here I have a picture of Robert Stutman, who was one of the most important people in crafting Reagan's strategy in the war on drugs. In October 1985, the DEA sent Robert Stutman to serve as the director of New York City's office of the DEA. That's the Drug Enforcement Administration. His strategy of calling attention in the media to drugs quickly bore fruit. First, he placed an article about crack that emerged the same month. In the coming year, thousands of stories swept across the national media, from Newsweek to Time and local newspapers, that crack ended up being the single biggest story since the Vietnam War. What happened with this level of panic about the drug war was the solution that was offered was abstinence, and I'll be talking about that, the DARE program, which was actually the brainchild of Daryl Gates, the same man who created the Fataram that I showed you. And it was a public-private partnership in which abstinence was used as the approach to the drug war. What came along with this, however, was lots of punitive legislation. So you have the passage of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act in 1986, the first one.